Hi guys, welcome back to BEC Preliminary course. How are you? Before we start today's class, let's take a quick look at what we've learned in the last class. So in the last class, we talked about management styles. Say we mentioned two types of management styles, the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. The bottom-up approach, 自下而上的管理方式 and the top-down approach, 自上而下的管理方式. And then we listened and studied a recording concerning a crisis meeting where 3 people at management level were discussing ways to deal with the Poland crisis. And lastly, we spent some time talking about how to follow up the action points agreed by the end of the meeting through email. Now, in today's class, we're going to continue talking about meetings. And in the first part of today's class, we're going to talk about steps to deal with crisis. And next, we're going to talk about a new type of meetings, off-site meetings. And meanwhile, we're going to learn some practical presentation skills. Now, crises happen every day. Some are economical, and some are political. Some are local, and others are international. Now here, let's take a look at a quiz about crisis. Here, I'd like you to complete the sentences about business crisis using the words in the box. So the words we have are fight, collapsed, damaged, cost, and hit. Okay? And altogether, we have 5 sentences. Now here, I'd like to give you 1 minute to do this. Ready? Here we go. Okay, great job. Now here, let's check your answers. Let's take a further look at the 5 sentences. Now, the first one, share prices collapsed last night following the U.S. political crisis. 由于受美国政治危机影响，股价暴跌 Share prices collapsed. So this is kind of a political crisis, right? Now, let's take a look at the second one. The retail sector was hit hard when interest rates went up again this month. 好，由于利率再次上调，零售业受重创。So the retail sector, 零售业, was hit hard. So this is another kind of crisis for the retailer sector. Now the third sentence. Enron's reputation was damaged after the allegations of financial malpractice. 好，这次金融事故的指控使世界500强安然公司名誉受损。So it's about, say, the brand image or the company's reputation crisis, right? The fourth one, the Salmonella incident cost the poultry industry millions in lost sales. 好，沙门菌氏事故使养禽业蒙受100万元的销售损失哈。So this sentence is about the Salmonella incident. It's also a kind of crisis in the food industry. Now the last one, UK banks will fight back after online fraud chaos. 英国将对网络欺诈予以回击。So this is also a crisis, and is an online fraud crisis. So in these 5 sentences, different crises are mentioned. As we said, the political crisis, the crisis facing the retailer sector, Enron's reputation crisis, and the Salmonella incident, and also the online fraud chaos. Now, let me ask you a question. Has any of these crises happened to your company? Or, say, any companies in your country? And how was the crisis dealt with? Great job and welcome back. Now, in the face of a crisis, it's not unusual for people like us to panic and also be at lost as to what to do. Therefore, the wise thing to do is have a crisis dealing procedure, 一个危机处理的流程, a procedure where you would know exactly what steps to follow when a crisis happens. Now here, let me ask you this. What do you think are the steps to deal with crisis? And in asking this question, I'd like you to think about your past experiences or the previous experiences of your companies, and then explain, okay? Okay, great job. Now here, we all know that companies need a strategy to deal with a crisis. Now here, I would like you to take a look at the 4 steps below. A. Decide who will be responsible for handling the crisis. B. Decide who will be the point of contact between your crisis team and the media. And C. Collect information and make sure you know the relevant facts. And D. Identify who you need to communicate with, your customers, the media, etc. So these are the 4 steps of a typical crisis communication plan. And now you need to put the 4 steps A to D in order. Okay, let me give you 15 seconds to do this. Okay, now here I'd like you to listen to a podcast by Alice Wins, a PR expert. And while listening, check your answers. Ready? Here we go.
Welcome to our Monday podcast for the 5th of March. Today, our guest speaker is Alice Wims, a PR expert, and she's going to talk about crisis management. Alice, over to you.
A business crisis can take many forms. Unhappy customers can, unfortunately, give a lot of trouble. Do you remember the recent headlines about the woman who said she found a human finger in her food at a Mega Burger restaurant? Mega Burger estimate that this situation cost them $2.5 million in lost sales. And the story of the finger was actually false. So if the unthinkable happens to you and your company, what do? How do you respond? Every organization needs a crisis plan to enable it to handle a crisis quickly and effectively. The most important part of crisis management is preventing a crisis in the first place. Take a hard look at your company and examine potential problems. An experienced public relations professional will help you to create your crisis communications plan. This contains 4 steps. First, collect information about the situation. Make sure you know the relevant facts. Second, appoint a crisis team. These people will be responsible for handling the crisis itself. Third, appoint a spokesperson. This person will typically serve as the point of contact between your crisis team and the media. Fourth, identify your key audiences, your customers, employees, salespeople, and the media. If the worst should happen, don't panic. Take a deep breath and collect your crisis team. Examine the situation quickly and decide on the appropriate action, as well as the message you want to send to your customers, your employees, and the public in general. The most important actions in a crisis are acting quickly to resolve the situation, telling the truth, being available for the press, showing confidence and compassion, communicating changes in the situation as quickly as you can. You've probably seen that when a customer experiences a problem and you resolve it for them quickly, that customer becomes more loyal than they were before the problem. The same phenomenon is true in a crisis. Communicating quickly and effectively to your key audiences can actually strengthen your brand image in their eyes.
Thank you, Alice. Thanks for listening, podcasters. Don't miss our talk next week. Same day, same time.
Okay, so much for the listening. Now here, let's check your answers. Now, according to this podcast, the first step to take is collect information and make sure you know the relevant facts. And then you need to decide who will be responsible for handling the crisis. And then decide who will be the point of contact between your crisis team and the media. And lastly, identify who you need to communicate with, say your customers, the media, etc. Now, the presenter for the podcast, Alice Wins, seemed to have done a great job, isn't it? In no more than 3 minutes, she was able to explain clearly what steps to follow during a crisis. Now, what she did in the podcast was presenting her ideas within 3 minutes. And it is a mini presentation that she gave. So what presentation skills did she use to make her presentation a success? Now, let's take a further look. Let's first listen to the first part of the podcast and find out how the speaker jump-start the presentation. Here, I would like to explain the phrase jump-start. So jump-start literally means start, begin. So start the presentation, begin the presentation. But it's not any kind of start. It's not any kind of beginning. It's a vigorous start, a vigorous beginning. Now, before we listen to this part, I'd like to remind you of the attention curve during the presentation that we have talked about last time. So this attention curve, as we have mentioned last time, shows how the audience's attention rises and falls during a presentation. And we mentioned that in the first 1 or 2 minutes of the presentation, the audience's attention is at the highest. And after that, the audience's attention dropped dramatically until it rises again at the end of the presentation. Therefore, during the first 1 or 2 minutes, it's very important for the speaker, the presenter, to best use the high attention of the audiences. 好，我们在前面的关于演讲技巧的这个课堂中讲到哈，不同的听众呢其实是带着不同的问题来听你的演讲的，而要是你的演讲的效果最大化呢，你就得在一开始的时候就把听众的这些问题给解答了。那么虽然说不同的听众有不同的问题，但是他们的问题呢不外乎就这3大类 ：Who, What, and Why. Who means who you are, right? 你是谁？你这个演讲者是谁？你有什么样的资历，能够站到这个讲台上跟我们分享这些东西？ So this is who. The second question is about what. So what is this presentation about? 今天的演讲的主旨是什么？ OK, 我们将听到些什么？ And lastly, why? Why am I here? 好，今天演讲这些东西对我有什么用处？ OK, what benefits does it have for me? So to sum up, the speaker needs to answer these typical questions that audiences have in mind. Who, what, and why. 但是呢，我们之前讲到过的如何开始演讲的这个步骤，适用于任何一种演讲，而且呢，是每个人都能用，而且是一学就能用的，因为它比较的简单。那换句话说呢，这是一个比较安全的步骤啦。但是我们知道，如果大家都选择 the safe option， 那么还有谁会去创新呢？那么大家的演讲的特色在哪儿呢？ So before giving a presentation, you could also think about how could I make it different? 那待会儿呢，我们要听到这个 Alice 的这一段演讲的开头呢，其实就是和我们之前所说的 Who, What, Why 3步走不一样了。Okay? Now here, let's listen to the first part of this podcast and find out how the speaker jumped to start the presentation. Ready? Here we go.
A business crisis can take many forms. Unhappy customers can, unfortunately, give a lot of trouble. Do you remember the recent headlines about the woman who said she found a human finger in her food at a Mega Burger restaurant? Mega Burger estimate that this situation cost them $2.5 million in lost sales. and the story of the finger was actually false.
Okay, now let's take a look. Now you may read the script of this part. So the question is, what was the speaker doing in this part? What was she doing? Great, she's telling a piece of news that's familiar to probably most of the people. But the thing is, she introduced a short, simple, yet unusual and surprising result. And the result is, Bec estimate that this situation cost them $2.5 million in lost sales, and the story of the finger was actually false. 好，演讲者以一个大家都比较熟悉的热点新闻事件开头。他上来就问Do you remember the recent headlines about the woman who said she found a human finger in her food at a Bec restaurant? 大家是否还记得这段时间的一个头条新闻就是说一个女性消费者在 Bec 的餐厅里的食物里面发现了一个人的手指。好，像这种的在餐厅食物里面发现了人的手指这种骇人听闻的事件呢，应该来说会给大部分的听众留下非常深刻的印象。所以呢，他会选取这样一个大家都还记得的，而且是比较熟悉的热点新闻事件开头，引起大家的共鸣。这个 speaker 讲的东西我知道，但是用简短的一句话把这个新闻事件复述一遍之后呢，这个 speaker 话锋一转，紧接着他道出了大家可能都不太知道的两个结果。第一是他给 Bec 这个销售额方面带来的损失损失是非常的惨重。那么其次呢 ，The story of the finger was actually false. Who'd know that? 原来是个乌龙事件那么大家可以想想，这个 speaker 在这里做这样一个转折有什么样的用处呢？ Okay, great. So by introducing shocking statement or startling statistic, the speaker is able to get a high level of attention with a shock effect. And also the speaker is able to give another voice. Okay, so this is the first tip that the speaker used to jumpstart her presentation, which is use a shocking statement or startling statistic. Now, the second tip that she used to jumpstart her presentation is question and answer. So in the beginning of her presentation, she asked a question, but she didn't expect an answer from the audience. So by using this tip, the speaker is able to raise expectations and also engage the audience in problem-solving thinking. And lastly, make the audience want to see what's on the next page, what's next. Okay, so much for the two tips that the speaker used to jumpstart her presentation. Now here, let's take a look at some other tips you can use to jumpstart your presentation. Now the first one is called Meet the Audience. So you can make your audience feel welcome as they arrive. You can smile, make introductions, say a few words about yourself, and also you can ask some questions. And also, of course, you can offer your audience coffee or tea or some other refreshments. So the benefits of doing this is to break the ice, initiate dialogue, calm your nerves, create interaction, and also build a relationship. And the second tip you can use is called What's in it for me? WIIFM. So while doing this, you are addressing the audience's needs and concerns by telling them what benefits they will gain from listening to your presentation. And also, try to use the word you when you do this. And this technique helps to focus on the needs of your audience, focus on benefits and not features, create desire and anticipation, raise expectations, and also build rapport. Now, the last tip that I want to discuss is called enrollment questions. So in the beginning of the presentation, you can question the audience directly and get them to respond to you by answering yes or no, or simply by raising hands. And this technique helps to focus the audience on the subject, generate an interactive relationship, create dialogue, and also build interest. Now, as far as I know, a lot of presenters are using this technique, are using this enrollment questions tip, simply because this is a very effective technique. Now here, let's take a look at this part one more time. And this time, we're going to focus on the language points. Now here, let's take a look at the first sentence. A business crisis can take many forms. 由此呢，我们可以联想到另一个短语 take form. Take form means develop into a distinctive entity. For example, we have a sentence, our plans began to take form. So take form literally means take shape. Our plans began to take shape. Now here, let's take a look at this sentence. Burger estimate that this situation cost them $2.5 million in lost sales. So the phrase lost sales means the difference between actually sold items and the potentially sold items. 一起来做个小练习吧。Okay, great job and welcome back. Now here, let's listen to the second part of the podcast and identify the techniques, the tips that the speaker used. Ready? Here we go.
So, if the unthinkable happens to you and your company, what do? How do you respond? Every organization needs a crisis plan to enable it to handle a crisis quickly and effectively. The most important part of crisis management is preventing a crisis in the first place. Take a hard look at your company and examine potential problems.
Okay, so here is the script for this part. Now, the question is, what techniques did the speaker use in this part? Okay, great job. Now, actually, the speaker used two of the techniques that we have learned in the previous part. The first one is, what's in it for me? So here, let's take a look at the first sentence. So, if the unthinkable happens to you and your company, what do you do? How do you respond? 到了这一步哈，这个 speaker 呢，应该来说还是在引入他要演讲的这个主题。那么在这个过程当中呢，他不断的提到的一个字是 you、your， 是解决你的问题，你会如何做？那像这样的技巧呢，我们之前提到过，就是 What's in it for me？ 那么他这样做呢，就可以触发听众的思考哈。真的，如果是我遇到这样的问题，我会怎么做 ？Okay, so this is the first technique. What's in it for me? And the second technique the speaker used here is question and answer. 演讲者一上来呢，就问了两个问题，而这两个问题呢，是不需要听众立刻做出回答的。那么这样的技巧我们叫做 question and answer。那么这样做的好处呢，我们前面已经提到了，就是和听众和观众产生互动。 Okay, so much for the techniques that the speaker used to jumpstart her presentation. Now here, let's focus on the language points in this part. Now the first phrase I'd like you to pay attention to is in the first place. Now the sentence is, the most important part of crisis management is preventing a crisis in the first place. Okay, so here, in the first place means in the beginning. For example, we should never have agreed to this in the first place. Now the second phrase I'd like to introduce is take a hard look at. Say, take a hard look at your company and examine potential problems. So take a hard look at means to examine something carefully. For example, I think we ought to take a hard look at who's responsible for this. Okay, so much for the second part of the podcast. Now here, let's listen to the next part of the podcast and find out how the presenter signposted. So before we listen, I'd like you to take a look at the graph, the attention curve, one more time. So as we've mentioned earlier, the audience's attention drops dramatically during the presentation until it rises again at the end of it. And in order to make your presentation more effective, you need to make efforts to constantly drag the audience's attention back during the presentation. And to do this, there is a technique that you can use. And do you still remember what the technique is? Great. It's called signpost. Now here, I'd like you to listen to this part of the podcast and find out how she signposted. Ready? Here we go.
An experienced public relations professional will help you to create your crisis communications plan. This contains 4 steps. First, collect information about the situation. Make sure you know the relevant facts. Second, appoint a crisis team. These people will be responsible for handling the crisis itself. Third, appoint a spokesperson. This person will typically serve as the point of contact between your crisis team and the media. Fourth, identify your key audiences, your customers, employees, salespeople, and the media.
Okay, so the question is how the speaker signposted. Great. So the speaker signposted by introducing a list, right? So she said, this contains 4 steps. First, second, third, and fourth. 好，通过使用这样的一些标志词这样一些 signposts， 那么这个演讲者呢，可以使他的整个演讲、整个 speech 听起来呢会更有条理性、更逻辑性。那么另外一方面呢，也可以把一部分听众的注意力给拉回来哈。Okay, now let's take a look at some language points in this part. So here I'd like you to pay attention to the verb appoint. Say here, second, appoint a crisis team. These people will be responsible for handling the crisis itself. So here the verb appoint is a frequently used verb in business English. It means to select or assign someone to serve in a particular role. And next, I'd like to introduce a phrase, point of contact. So here, third, appoint a spokesperson. This person will typically serve as the point of contact between your crisis team and the media. So here, a point of contact means a person or a department serving as the coordinator of information concerning an activity or program. Okay, so much for this part. Now here, let's listen to the last part of the podcast and answer the question below. Why did the presenter talk about the customer experience? Ready? Here we go.
You've probably seen that when a customer experiences a problem and you resolve it for them quickly, that customer becomes more loyal than they were before the problem. The same phenomenon is true in a crisis. Communicating quickly and effectively to your key audiences can actually strengthen your brand image in their eyes.
Okay, so much for this part. Now here you may read the script for this part. Okay, so apparently the presenter is talking about some other customers' experiences. But why? Why the presenter chose to talk about some other customers' experiences at the end of the presentation? Great. So actually, in this part, the speaker told a story about how a customer experiences a problem and how the problem is solved. And the reason why she told such a story is that the story itself is related to crisis management. And by telling the story at the end of the presentation, you can be more positive and dramatic. And this can strengthen the effectiveness of your presentation. Okay, so much for the storytelling. Now here, let's focus on the language points in this part. So here, I'd like you to focus on the last sentence. Communicating quickly and effectively to your key audiences can actually strengthen your brand image in their eyes. So the presenter is talking about brand. Now here, let's take a look at some words concerning brand. The first one, brand awareness or brand recognition, means 品牌认知度. And second one, brand image, means 品牌形象. And the last one, branding. So branding is creating and keeping the brands in customers' minds through advertising. So it means 品牌化. Okay, so much for this part and so much for this podcast. So here, let's take a quick review of some of the tips that you can use in your presentation. Now, the first group of tips are called tips to jumpstart a presentation. So we have shocking statement or startling statistic, question and answer, meet the audience, what's in it for me, enrollment questions. And also, we mentioned a technique to make your presentation more positive and dramatic, which is storytelling. Okay, that's all for the crisis management, and this is the first part of today's class. Now here, let's quickly move on to the next part, off-site meetings. Now, sometimes companies decide to take a group of managers away from the office for a short period to work on a project or to make key decisions. And this type of a meeting is called off-site meetings. Now here, I'd like you to think about this. What are the pros and cons of off-site meetings? Okay, great job. Now, we're about to read a short article about the company GeoPost, a France-based transport company, and how and why the company chose to hold an off-site meeting. But before we do that, I'd like to spend some time introducing the company GeoPost. So, GeoPost was created in 1999 by La Poste, a French postal service, and it has grown rapidly by acquiring other companies. And in 2003, it was the third largest parcel company in Europe. 好，这家由法国邮政于1999年创办的包裹运输公司呢，主要是通过收购其他的公司而发家的哈。那我们知道，一般来说，如果一个公司被另外一个公司收购的话，那么原来这家公司呢是不能够再保留它原有的品牌。但是呢，我们今天要讲这个 GeoPost 这个公司哈。它做法是不一样的，它在收购了其他的公司之后，是允许原来的这些公司保留它原有的品牌，甚至呢是允许这样一些公司保留它原有的一些运营理念跟运行方式。那这样做呢，就会必然遇到一个沟通的问题。那么既然说已经收购你们公司了，又允许你们公司保留原有的一些公司的运营理念和运营方式，那么这收购还有什么意义呢？而且呢 GeoPost 集团下的这些公司如何能够在价值观上以及目标上达成一致呢？那么这些问题呢，其实也一直在困扰着 GeoPost。但是他们想出了一种非常特别的沟通方式来解决这个问题。And this is called off-site meetings. Now here, let's read an article about off-site meetings and find the answer to the question below. Where was the meeting held? Ready? Here we go. Okay, great job. Now the question is, where was the meeting held? Great, it's held in the Arctic Circle. So where is the Arctic Circle? Right, is 北极圈. So who would hold a meeting in the Arctic Circle? It's so cold. And also you have no access to the internet. So why? Why did they choose to hold a meeting there? Now let's take a further look. So first of all, let's read the first two paragraphs and answer the question. What was the objective for this meeting? Ready? Here we go. Okay, so the question is, what was the objective for this meeting? Okay, so the last sentence. Geopost needed to make some key decisions about the group's structure and bring together what was a diverse group of companies. So it has to do with the group's structure. 好，这个集团的结构的问题。那么同时呢，这里提到一个词 diverse。A diverse group of companies. 好，前面我们已经提到了哈 ，Geopost 集团在收购其他公司的时候，是允许他们保留原来的品牌以及原来一些运行的方式。那所以说，他们集团下面的公司会非常的多样化。而一个集团要能够正常的运转的话，在保留其多样性的同时呢，还是要有一个一致的方向和一致的理念。那么这两个问题呢，就摆在了此次会议的议程当中。Okay.Now here, let's focus on the language points. Now in the first paragraph, an annual summer meeting of Geopost was mentioned. And here, let's take a look at some other types of meeting. So we have chat. Chat means informal discussion with colleagues, say at the coffee machine or something. And also we have brainstorming, 头脑风暴. Project meeting, 项目会议. Department meeting, 部门会议 board meeting. So board meeting means an official and formal meeting of a company's directors. And lastly, we have EGM. And EGM is short for Extraordinary General Meeting. So this is a shareholders meeting to discuss an important issue, such as a proposed merger. Now, let's take a look at the objectives for this meeting. And as we said, part of the objectives for this meeting has to do with the group structure. 好，一个集团的结构的问题哈。那么提到这个公司或者说集团的结构呢，我们看一下这两张图。那么左边这张图显示的是这个公司或者说这个集团之前的一个架构的情况哈。那么经过架构调整之后呢，就出现了右边的这张图。那么大家会发现重组之后的架构呢，这个人员上变少了，但有些人是被裁了哈。那么同时呢，这个层级关系也更少了。那么在提到架构重组的时候呢，我们常常会提到这样一个词 downsize. So downsize means to dismiss or lay off from work. For example, workers who were downsized during the recession. 那我们刚刚提到的这个结构重组或者说公司架构重组呢，我们是说 restructure. So restructure means to make basic change in company's structure. 那么一般来说，公司的结构经过重组之后呢，会呈现一个更加扁平化的结构。那么更加扁平化的结构，我们说是 a flatter and leaner structure. 好，通过阅读这两段，我们知道 Geopost 这个集团呢，之所以要那么大费周折的把40个高管拉到这个北极圈去开会，是因为呢，他们确实有重大的决定需要做。那么这个决定呢，会影响到这个公司的架构以及未来的发展方向。Now here, let's read the next two paragraphs and answer the question. What did they do when they got there? Okay, now, what did they do when they got there?Great. So the managers were forced to work on the relationships with one another, rather than keeping in touch with their company headquarters back home. 好，因为在北极圈这种地方确实是杳无人烟，而且呢是没有 WiFi， 手机没有信号。那么这40个高管呢在那里其他事情都干不了，而只能专注于和其他的高管讨论问题，并解决问题。Okay, so this is the point of having an offsite meeting.Now here, I'd like you to imagine that you need to make some key decisions about something like the Geopost managers. For example, your studies or your future career. So which of the following do you think is the best way to do it? I'd like you to think about it and talk about it. Let's 一起来做个小练习吧。Great job and welcome back. So here, let's take a review of what we have talked about in today's class. So this is the second class of meetings. And in today's class, we talked about the 4 steps to deal with crisis. And also, we mentioned some very practical presentation skills. And lastly, we spent some time talking about the point of off-site meetings. Okay, guys, that's all for today. Thank you for your time, and see you.